Long Voyage Back, page 206. The night was overcast, as Neil had hoped, although on the northern horizon a few stars could be seen, which indicated an approaching high-pressure system. With the wind blowing out the east at 15 knots, the passage out of the inlet would be rough. By midnight, they were putting the plan they developed into execution. Conrad Macklin had stolen a small abandoned fishing vessel named Moonchaser, and enough fuel to get it to where Neil wanted it. They had tied and tacked Vagabond's blue carpets along her white port sides and decking to reduce glare and the chances of being seen by the Coast Guard searchlight. They'd even packed mud on the lower part of the mast to cut down on reflection. Neil and Jim were on board the fishing smack, which was towing Vagabond's dinghy with his outboard motor tilted up. Frank was at the helm of the trimaran, with Ollie, Macklin, Jean and Lisa as crew. Skippy was asleep in the port berth. Katia was on call, and Tony was tied up in the forespeak. Neil had taken Tony back to the docks because he feared that he would get the authorities to investigate Vagabond. He had planned to leave Tony behind at the last minute, but Macklin had argued vehemently that Tony might still raise the alarm, and, besides, was the best sailor they had for a long voyage. When Frank agreed, Neil decided they could abandon Tony in the Bahamas if he wanted off, or didn't work out. The escape plan was for Neil and Jim to scuttle Moonchaser on the eastern side of the inlet at Shackleford Point, to draw the patrol launch over while Vagabond would motor along the western side of the inlet a quarter of a mile away, pick up Neil and Jim, who would cross the inlet in the dinghy to join them and make a run for it. As Neil steered the sluggish Moonchaser towards the inlet, a light rain began to fall. Neil had decided that he and Jim should take the decoy vessel because he had confidence that they could do the job, and because if Vagabond was seen and stopped, without them aboard, the Coast Guard might let the ship proceed, simply removing the deserter Tony. Of course, he hadn't told Macklin or Tony this. As he brought Moonchaser to within 3/4 of a mile of the patrol path of the cutter, he realised that with the rain falling, he could no longer depend on seeing the unlighted buoys and stakes that he'd planned to use to stay out of the main channel to avoid being spotted. Now he'd have to stay in the main channel, hoping the rain would cut visibility so much that he could get the old fishing smack scuttled before the Coast Guard came close enough to see them taking off in the dinghy. Jim stood beside him in the little wheelhouse, his face wet with rain from peering around the Salt Street window, trying to pick up the channel buoys and looking for signs of shore water. He could barely make out the flashing red light at the next channel marker, but beyond that he could see neither the running lights nor the searchlight of the Coast Guard patrol. Neil was keeping Moonchaser to the left of the main channel, motoring slowly forward against the incoming tide. Then, at a little after 1, he opened up the throttle and headed for Shackleford Point and the planned scuttling. Jim still saw no clear sign of the Coast Guard, except for brief flashes of white that Neil said were the searchlight. The wind had picked up and seemed to be blowing the rain and sea spray directly into his face. Although it was a warm rain, he was shivering. He had on a foul-weather jacket, but his legs were bare and cold beneath his swimsuit. Then he saw that Neil had said would be the last of the 2 lighted buoys before the point, a flashing red and a flashing green. He had to yell now over the noise of the engine. "I'll take us just to port of the red one," Neil shouted back. "Get its number! Watch for the cutter!" They seemed to approach the blinking red light on the red bell with aggravating slowness, but once they were there, Neil steered to within a few feet of the loud, mournful gonging, and Jim verified that it had 16 cents stenciled in white paint on its side. Almost the moment he looked forward again after he'd passed the bell, he saw the green starboard running light and the sweeping searchlight of the cutter. It seemed to be a quarter of a mile off in the darkness and wet wind, almost dead ahead. It was moving west across the channel, away from Shackleford Bank. Jim shouted this to Neil, who brought Moonchaser to a complete halt in the water, waiting while the cutter moved farther west and away from them. Once the light swept in their direction and played over the smack, but rapidly, without pausing. Though the glare temporarily blinded Jim, the cutter apparently didn't notice the black hull. Jim saw Neil look at his watch, grimace and increase speed. The rain was now only sporadic, but the wind was gusty and blew in sweeping bursts of spray against the windshield. Ocean swells made the boat pitch from side to side as they approached the open water of the ocean. In another 2 minutes the cutter was little more than halfway across the inlet, and still heading for the far side. Neil gave the boat full throttle, his face knitted in tense concentration, and Moonchaser pounded forward at 7 knots into the tide and the ocean swells. The small boat rose and smashed down one big swell that seemed to rear up out of the darkness like some living sea mammal, to lift them up momentarily and then toss them back into the water. Jim was thrown hard against the control panel, and Neil was swung around, still holding the wheel, to bang against the ship's coaming. "We may really need that mayday," he shouted with a grim smile. Jim, shivering, felt a fearful exhilaration. He peered ahead and could see two flashing white lights, one after the other, the lights of a range that normally guided ships down the centre of the channel, but that Neil would use to guide them onto the sands of Shackleford Bank. The Coast Guard cutter was off to the right someplace, but Jim could not make it out. "Bring the dinghy up closer," Neil shouted to him, and Jim stumbled aft, falling against the stern coaming when Moonchaser plunged down another swell. Righting himself, he hauled in the tow line to the dinghy until it was only a few feet off the stern, where he recleated it. Returning forward, he stared out into the rain and blackness again, and realised that Neil was easing the boat towards shore. "Hold on!" he shouted. "Here we go!" With a harsh, grating sound, the fishing vessel ran aground, slowing down at first, and then, as Neil killed the engine, stopping abruptly. Jim grabbed the deckhouse shelf and held on, looking to Neil for orders. As Moonchaser seemed to sit contentedly in the sand, Jim turned to get into the dinghy. A wave smashed broadside into the boat. With a tremendous crash, Jim was flung against Neil, and the two men smashed into the side of the deckhouse, and then against the coaming, and then they were in the sea. It happened so suddenly, and the chill water of the ocean was such a shock that Jim didn't realise clearly what had happened at first. He was standing in 4 feet of water that suddenly became 7 feet of water when a swell surged past. "Get the dinghy!" Neil shouted from somewhere off to the left. Jim could barely make out Moonchaser heeled over in the surf a few feet in front of him, but he struggled over to her stern and felt for the rubber dinghy. It was there, bobbing and tearing at the tow line like a wild horse. As he reached for it, the edge of the protruding outboard struck him on the shoulder. He swore, reached down again to control the dinghy, and was submerged by a huge swell that slapped him in the face like a lazy porpoise flipping its tail. He spit out salt water and felt a sudden panic. He couldn't get the dinghy. It danced away from him, then swung its engine shaft at him like a club. "Cut the line!" Neil shouted, appearing beside him and handing him a knife. Jim swam the few feet to Moonchaser's stern, pulled himself up and slashed the tow line. In an instant, the inflatable pulled its line out of Jim's grasp. In an instant, the inflatable pulled its line out of Jim's grasp, surged away in a breaking wave, and was swallowed up in the darkness. "Get it!" Neil screamed, and Jim plunged away after it. "Mayday! Mayday!" Ollie's voice crackled urgently as Frank stood by, operating Vagabond's radio telephone. "Damn engine went and killed himself. I'm aground on Shackleford Point. Mayday! Mayday! Do you read me? Over?" Frank switched to receive, deciding that Captain Ollie's unprofessional way of sending a distress call was probably more credible than the scenario he himself had planned. He leaned backward to look up at Macklin in the wheelhouse, who was expected to keep Vagabond heading steadily into the tide, barely inching forward. He nodded at him in reassurance. "Roger, Mayday," a distant static voice said from the radio. "This is the Coast Guard station at Fort Macon, acknowledging Mayday. Identify yourself and your position. Repeat, identify your vessel and your position. Over." Frank switched the button and nodded at Captain Ollie. "This is Captain Ollie," he said irritably. "Moonchaser is banging on the beach here at Shackleford Point and getting swamped. I'm at Shackleford Point, just south of the range. My ship is beginning to..." Captain Ollie banged his fist down on the console and shouted, "Jesus! Help! We're floundering! Help!" Frank cut the switch. They listened for the Coast Guard's response. "This is Fort Macaron Coast Guard calling Moonchaser," the voice said with more urgency. "Please repeat position and clarify. Over." Frank shook his head no to Captain Ollie and kept the button switched to receive. After 20 seconds, the voice came through again. "This is the Coast Guard calling Moonchaser. We have received your mayday. Will send assistance. Do you read me? Over." Frank shifted the dial to the frequency he knew the Coast Guard usually used for routine traffic. For 20 seconds there was nothing, but finally the same voice crackled out, calling the cutter Avenger. After they had established contact, the voice said, "A vessel named Moonchaser, radio to Mayday. Ship reports being aground and floundering off Shackleford Point. Can you provide assistance? Over." "Roger, Macon." "Affirmative. Are you sure it was a genuine Mayday? Over." Affirmative, Avenger. Sounded real to me. Over. Okay, Macon. Avenger headed for Shackleford to provide assistance. I'm going up, and get us moving full speed to the rendezvous, Frank said to Captain Ollie. Keep listening. After Frank went up on deck, Captain Ollie lowered his head towards the radio. For a minute or so there was nothing. Then, Avenger now, only about 300 yards off Shackleford. No sign of a vessel aground. Okay, Macon, we've got a light on a fishing smack aground, partially submerged. She's taking a pounding. Moon chaser? Yep, it's a moon chaser. No sign of anyone aboard. We're sending the lights to investigate. Stand by. As the seconds ticked by, Captain Ollie realised that Vagabond was beginning to pitch and smash into the ocean swells as she rushed at full speed towards the inlet. He heard Frank saying something loudly to Jean, but couldn't hear what. 2 minutes passed before the voice spoke again on the radio. This is Avenger. There's no one aboard Moonchaser, Macon. What was your last radio transmission from the vessel? Over. Just before we radioed you, Avenger. Over. Another long silence ensued, broken only by Fort Macon Coast Guard station asking Avenger if it's still read me. Affirmative, Macon. I'm waiting for my launch crew to report. Another silence. Captain Ollie realised that Vagabond was slowed down and become stationary again. She was pitching and slamming more deeply into the swells. They must be at the rendezvous point. Another minute, the voice returned. Avenger to Macon. Something strange going on here. Launch reports there's no radio aboard Moonchaser. How could she send a mayday?